It's a pleasure to have Richard Brown joining us today, CTO of R3. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Tina.
No, it's fantastic. So we are going to cover maybe the last 5 years in enterprise blockchain and what's been happening at Corda. Before we get into the design of the protocol itself and what R3 has been up to in those 5 years, how has the offering or the tech changed, and how has that impacted your roadmap over the last 5 years? I'm sure there's been some key lessons learned that have contributed to iterations along the way.
Yeah, so people don't always realize this, but R3 was not founded as a software firm. I wasn't hired to build a product. The original vision, if you like, the original contract for that first year was to run this exploratory collaborative working group. It was only the results of that, and they appeared quite early on in that year, but they began to evolve over time. It was only the results of that made us realize that the world needed a platform that was built from the ground up to solve the problems we were discovering. Because we were discovering things like the following, that yes, if you could ensure that all the parties to a complicated syndicated loan, say, were in sync, all the different lenders received information about the underlying, the underlying loan at the right time and in the right place. If you could solve that problem and remove all these inconsistencies and errors between firms, it could be extraordinarily valuable. If you could enable, tokens representing claims against a bank to move around between that bank's customers without the bank having to sign off on every single transaction, that could be insanely useful. So we kind of validated the underlying belief that these technological principles could solve problems in finance. But what we also discovered, which again is obvious, but you have to go through the process, is that some of the things that, take Bitcoin, for example, some of the things that are just like non-negotiable and have to work this way in Bitcoin are not appropriate for a banking scenario. For example, for good engineering reasons, the entire Bitcoin blockchain needs to be replicated to all nodes. Everybody has to be able to validate everything. There's a good reason for that, and it works that way as a result. We kind of have the opposite problem in finance, where the only people who should see a deal or know that it exists and then be in sync about it are the parties to that deal. It's not relevant to anybody else.
What were the most critical features that you realized at the beginning would need to differ from Bitcoin's design? And what were the most pertinent components of Bitcoin that were both unique and useful in the context of an enterprise use case?
Great question. So what is Corda? So Corda is a platform for writing applications. So one way to think about it is a bit like Ethereum. Ethereum by itself does nothing, but Ethereum allows you to write smart contracts and then allows you to deploy them. And Corda is similar in that way, in that Corda allows software firms, banks, insurance companies, anybody who wants to write applications where the purpose of those applications is to be deployed to and amongst all the participants in a market or who are executing a certain type of transaction. So rather than writing an application that runs inside one firm, as has been traditional in IT, you write an application that automates and improves the processes of an entire market, reinsurance, syndicated lending, or whatever it is. So it's so the idea is you can write an application, you write it once, and then all the participants deploy it. And the key problem that Corda is solving is that for each piece of data being managed by this application, a loan or an insurance policy or anything like that, the Corda makes sure that it is received by all the people who should have a copy, and the copy they receive is identical. So everybody knows, sort of the catchphrase we use, that when I'm looking at my Corda node, I know for sure that what I see is what you see. We both know that we see the same thing, but critically and differently to some of the the true cryptocurrencies, is you only see the things you're supposed to. You don't see transactions you're not supposed to, and for the reasons I've just described. So what do you need to make that work? Well, you need the ability to write the applications. Well, it's not sexy, but most application developers in large organizations, they don't know things like Solidity or Bitcoin script. They know languages like Java or Kotlin. So we make it possible to write the applications in those languages on Corda. What we also discovered, and this was not part of my original vision, this was something that Mike Hearn, I guess, intuited the need for as we went, was that it's not sufficient to simply move around signed transactions to say, yes, I agree that this loan is now this value and it's between you and me. It's not enough to create the transaction and sign it and then link it to the previous version as a chain of transactions with unspent outputs and all those things that you see in, say, a Bitcoin style architecture. You need all those things, and Corda is heavily influenced by the Bitcoin UTXO model. But you also need some way of moving them around, because before you and I can sign a transaction that says you owe me $1 million, well, we have to negotiate it. What's the interest rate? Who else needs to be involved? We have to agree, and we have to have a way of describing how this data moves around the network, who's responsible for doing which step next. So almost by accident, we realized that we also had to build a decentralized workflow engine. We needed a way to describe what each participant in the network's role was. Who's the buyer, who's the seller, who's the borrower, who's the lender. We needed a way to describe that orchestration of behavior in a way that doesn't have a central conductor, a central controller. So we discovered the need for additional features like that.
So how have clients' interests and requirements evolved over this time? You started out trying to address, the banking use case and seemed to be the most obvious sector for delivering results, but you've also played in the areas of healthcare and trade finance and shipping and insurance. And are these use cases now becoming easier sectors to attack and solve problems with Corda?
We designed Corda thinking its target market wasn't even just banks, because we thought it was the back offices of investment banks, because they were the original R3 members. It was the big US dealer banks were the original backers of R3. So I thought I was building quite a narrowly focused platform for solving problems in the back offices of the big investment banks. But I guess you could say we got lucky. We ended up with, and this is partly because of the team. I hope some of it was my insight, a huge dollop of luck and a huge dollop of insight from people like Mike Hearn. But we ended up with a design that, whilst it was derived from all these requirements in financial services, turned out serendipitously to be far more broadly applicable. And I was slow to realize that, because I was fixated on these financial services use cases. And it was only when one of our senior executives in the US, Ryan Rugg, kept badgering me, that I realized, because she kept saying to me, Richard, you don't realize you've built a platform that is perfect for insurance. And I said, well, that's interesting, but that's not what I'm focused on. And it was only when we discovered that, completely independently of us, that various insurance consortia had independently discovered Corda and had built on the open source version, that I began to pay attention. So it's kind of great. Just, I say serendipity, but that doesn't happen very often in your career, when you think you've solved a narrow problem, and then the market tells you you've actually solved a much broader problem. And then, as you say, trade finance has been great. Contour, Marco Polo, these big trade networks are using it. Healthcare, oil and gas, even gold trading. Tradewind markets up in North America were amongst the very first adopters of Corda, and they're going great guns for the tokenization of gold.
So how many projects and use cases do you think you guys have now out in the wild doing their thing?
Oh, heavens. I don't know, hundreds, literally hundreds, all at different levels of maturity. So we may come on to talk about some of the large scale production projects. There are lots of small scale production projects, and then a whole bunch of others in the pipeline. And I guess it's also part of again, I keep using the word serendipity, but it is the serendipity of the platform being open source. It's the core Corda protocol, the code base that defines the protocol is open source. Go to GitHub/Corda, there it is. So there's a whole bunch of people using it who we don't hear from until they've gone live, and then they say, you know what, we'd like to pay for support on this, or we'd like to have better performance, and then we discover that there's people using it that we can then potentially sell the commercial version to if it fits their needs. So for a while we had it's something that we need to refresh it, but we had a website called our marketplace, where we showcased all the projects we were aware of, and that was when I last looked at that, it was a year or so ago, and there were hundreds, and it's only increased since then. So it's been quite a ride.
Well, and I think when people think about enterprise blockchain, they don't necessarily, correlate network effect with, enterprise, right? They kind of seem to be disconnected in some way. But what I'm hearing from you is that, the network effect has indeed triggered expansion and wider adoption across multiple different sectors from Corda.
Just on that, just very quickly, I agree. I won't claim it's been easy, and I did have this belief at first that eventually there will be a single global Corda network, like the single global Bitcoin or Ethereum network. It hasn't played out like that yet. There is a Corda network. There are many different projects on it, but there are also a large number of standalone networks. And then the question then is, well, is there a network effect between them? Technologically, not yet, although you can integrate and interoperate between them. But there's this sort of like meta network effect, which is, people want to build on platforms that they know will be around for the long term. So even if they don't plan to integrate with each other, people are making long-term bets. So they want to see that the firm is hopefully well run, well capitalized, but also that it's technologically on the right path, so that they don't have to do a sort of handbrake turn in a year and re-platform.
So let's talk about one of the more interesting projects. Teana Baker DLT platform. Sounds like you've got about 100 banks and 200 million transactions. It was built on Corda. Tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, this one's mad because it's you build these things and it's always in the abstract. You build your platform and you hope people will use it, and then I didn't wake up one day because we've been heavily involved and there's been it's been a hard process. But it's as if you wake up one day and you discover, like, oh my God, the Italian banking system now depends on Corda. Yeah. So the idea here is, you think about all the hundreds of different banks and all their branches in Italy. There's a process, a fairly manual process until recently they were running to reconcile between them. So it doesn't sound that exciting, but it's fundamental to the integrity of a country's banking system. Checking that if one bank is holding a deposit with the other one, do they agree about the amount? Do they agree that a payment from one to the other has been correctly recorded on each side? So it's an important process. In Italy, there are some interesting contextual factors that make it ripe for, excuse me, that make it ripe for this kind of project. There is a large network provider called SEA. They are a huge provider of infrastructure, big across continental Europe, but they've already linked securely all the banks in Italy. There is the Italian Banking Association and their labs, ABI Labs, who heavily visionary and weren't just interested in doing POCs, but saw they'd done the analysis. They realized that this specific reconciliation process was time-consuming, manual, prone to error, and was absolutely perfect for the I know that what I see is what you see promise of Corda. And then they selected Corda for this, and then full credit to them. They brought the industry with them. They brought the market with them. They went through many stages of development on this. It was a long process, and you've got to remember that we were building Corda at the same time. So they were very tolerant of us as as Corda matured. We fixed problems. We evolved it to meet their needs. So it was so great to see it go live properly at the start of this year, and then really ramp up in the last few weeks. So it's but it's no small pressure, because here I am as the CTO of R3, knowing that the integrity of the Italian banking system depends on our software. So it's this like formidable responsibility as well as a great feeling.
What's happening in the Corda space around fiat-backed tokens, CBDCs, collateral management systems? What kind of work are you guys doing around settlement interoperability?
Yep. So this is where I'm going to show my. I'm actually not fully up to speed on some of this. So there's we've done a huge amount of, and I guess like every firm, we've done a huge amount of proofs of concept over the last few years, proving what it would, or showing what would be necessary for a central bank to issue a claim on the sovereign, whether it was early work in Canada, Japan, Singapore. There's another one we're involved in, but I don't know if it's public, so I won't say it, and then I can text you afterwards and you can add it over the top. So there's a whole bunch of work we're doing with CBDC, but there's the other side of it, which is exactly as you say, which is if you look at our customers on using Corda, they need the ability to settle now. And it doesn't follow that the only way you can settle is with an on-ledger token. Clearly, that makes it easier in some cases. But the firms using Corda, the firms using all these different applications that are being deployed, they already have bank accounts. They already have integrations to their existing banks. So we spent a lot of time, and the first version of this was something we called Corda Settler. The insight was, it's not necessary to settle across the same ledger as where the obligations live, provided when you as the payer have made the payment, across whichever rails, just say through the domestic scheme, whatever you want, provided that once you've made it, you can prove you've done it irrevocably and irrefutably to the recipient. Because the problem really with payments, or one of the big problems, is being able to reach consensus that it happened. So have I sent it to the right place? Did you receive it? That's where the mess happens. So if we can use the flow framework in Corda to negotiate where I'll send the payment and what you as the recipient will accept as irrefutable proof, now the onus is on me as the payer. I make the payment, I get the proof. Maybe it's a signature from the recipient bank, maybe it's a signature from Swift, with whom we've also been doing work. I can now take that signature, attach it to the transaction on Corda, and use that to move the smart contract to the completed state. And you as the recipient, you don't get the right to mess around and say it hasn't arrived, because I've provided the proof. So we stay in consensus, and all that mess and pain of payments goes away. So net, we're trying to do both. We're doing a lot of work on bringing central bank or commercial bank backed tokens onto the platform, and there's quite a few advanced projects there. But also accepting and acknowledging that in many cases, simply being able to settle across existing rails is perfectly fine for many. And the problem to be solved there is, how do you prove you've done it?
Okay, so what's next, Richard? What's on your roadmap for the next 12 to 24 months? What are you most excited to see get developed?
So a few things. So I guess there's Corda, there's customers, and then there's broadening the offering. So customers first. We've just heard all this noise about and news about Spunter really hitting prime time. There's a whole bunch of other projects behind them that are in early go live that will really hit scale next year. So I'm really looking forward to seeing sort of the real scale out of the trade networks like Marco Polo and Contour and things like that. There's a whole bunch of work being done with digital assets that I've not even talked about, such as the work being done by the Swiss Digital Exchange and projects like that. So there's some MasterCard have been very open about what they're doing with Corda. So there's some big firms doing some projects that should all really hit the mainstream later this year or into 2021. Corda itself, and we're deep in planning for what we're calling Corda 5. So everything we've learned from all this work over the last 5 years, we're using that to figure out where we should evolve the platform. How do we make it, and it doesn't sound that exciting, but how do we make it easier to deploy? How do we make it easier to upgrade? How do we make it easier to write apps? All the hygiene stuff that takes POCs and takes projects and makes them repeatable and affordably. And then the final thing, and this is a lot of my focus right now, is actually broadening the offering. Because if we go back all the way to the beginning, what were we talking about? We're talking about how do you get participants in a market? How can they collaborate and cooperate better around their data for some better outcome for them and their customers? And Corda and blockchain is all about, you and I have done a deal. How do we ensure we're in sync? But once you start building platforms and you roll stuff out like in Italy, where all these firms are talking to each other, it's not just about sharing data. Often there's some outcome you want where you can't share the data. And there's like a very simple example is, let's imagine all the manufacturers in a country of a particular widget, they're desperate to know what their market share is. But you can't share your sales data with your competitors. It's probably anti-competitive, and also it's commercially sensitive. But if each of you could share your sales data with some trusted party in the middle, they could add it together and then give you the total, and you could calculate your market share. But of course, that central party would then be really powerful, and that's the basis, I guess, of many market data firms. That's how they make their money. You generalize that, and you end up with business models like Bloomberg's and so forth. But given that we're already building out these networks that allow these firms to talk to each other and share data, the only missing piece is the ability to centralize that data, perform a calculation, and send it back without that central party seeing anything. And that's the essence of something called confidential computing, which, if you like, is a sister technology to blockchain. We've been working on this for several years because we need it for a particular privacy aspect of Corda, but we're now in beta, and it will GA at the start of next year, a product called Conclave, which is all about allowing you, and it kind of sounds counterintuitive, but it will allow firms to build applications where I can send data to you and I will know exactly what you will do with it. I'll be able to know that you'll do one thing, but you can do nothing else. So I could send my sales data to you, you can calculate the average and send it back, but you couldn't publish it on the front page of the New York Times. So that idea, making it easy to share data whilst being able to control how it's used, we're making that mainstream, we're making it easy to use, and that will be generally available next year.
Fantastic. Richard, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. I haven't seen you since pre-lockdown, so it's nice to see your face. And thanks for coming on and giving us an update on what's been happening at R3.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.